mobilization and contentious politics, and the kind of broad mobilization that we saw in the context of the Arab uprisings. So kind of say that, okay, we want to understand where the place of Islamist politics is in the Arab uprisings, but I want to say that that is kind of subsidiary question. The main question really should be about what are the bases of mobilization, why contentious politics occurs, who are the people who are protesting and contesting, and so on, and then where Islamist politics fits into this configuration. I'm just wondering if you can hear me without this? No? Okay, so in this talk then I would like to reflect on the question of Islamist politics and the Arab uprisings, and specifically on how to understand Islamist politics in the context of broad mobilization. My central argument is that oppositional politics of the uprisings cannot be understood as either a negation of or an assertion of support for Islamist politics. So the Arab uprisings cannot be thought of as Islamist uprisings or anti-Islamist uprisings or non-Islamist uprisings. They need to be thought on their own terms, and then we can see where Islamist politics fits into that. But as I said, there are now readings that these uprisings were Islamist. They were in the end about bringing about the Islamic State, the Islamist agenda of having an Islamic state and implementing the Sharia. And some would argue that that's not the case. In fact, they are Islamism and Islamist politics are not really central. So I suggest that this problematic of the relationship between Islamist politics and the events of the uprisings must be situated in relations to the grounds and infrastructures of action in the everyday. And I just want to kind of, between parentheses, to say that I draw primarily on Egypt and also just on my work on Cairo to make these propositions. So, of course, there could be variations in context, but I think also that the analytical elements that I outline in the approach stands to be used or deployed in other settings. So I think my terms of analysis are relevant beyond Cairo, and perhaps in the discussion we can come to that. So just to reiterate then, I'm thinking that we need to kind of situate the uprisings in relationship to the grounds of action in the everyday, and I begin by briefly considering two opposing views on the matter of the relationship between Islamist politics and the Arab uprising. One view posits that the Arab uprisings are an expression of post-Islamist politics or post-Islamism. The second view asserts that the uprisings represent a victory of Islamism. And of course that is a statement made on the basis of the outcome of the elections that took place in Egypt and Tunisia following the events of mass mobilization in both countries. And these are the kind of the most relevant examples to talk about the victory of the Islamists. So I want to go very briefly over these two views and then step back to look at Islamist politics on the eve of the uprising, to say what did Islamist politics look like on the eve of the uprisings, and then what happened following that. And so I want to also, in stepping back to just prior to the uprisings, I want to trace some key developments and transformation, and then situate these in relation to the broader socio-political context. And again, my main example is Egypt. I then examine the grounds of revolutionary mobilization and conclude by exploring the links between Islamist politics and this mobilization. So I'm going to just begin now by very briefly outlining these two views on the relationship between Islamist politics and the uprising. So examining the events of the uprisings a number of scholars, most notably Olivier Roy and Nassif Bayat, have argued that these are a confirmation of the coming of post-Islamism or post-Islamist politics. Roy's contention, I think you are familiar with his earlier work on the failure of political Islam and on the post-Islamist thesis. His contention about the post-Islamist uprisings really reiterate many of the arguments that he made in his early work. I mean, the failure of political Islam was written more than 2 decades ago. And his contention that he's making today about the revolutionary uprisings, there being post-Islamist, reiterate or repeat many of the arguments that he'd made earlier on in the failure of political Islam, and then later elaborated as the post-Islamism thesis. This failure, according to Roy, stems from the absence or lack of a revolutionary dynamic in Islamist politics or for the Islamist project. Roy had argued and continues to argue that Islamists are, in his view, better understood as new fundamentalists, meaning that they are primarily concerned with issues of morality. They're focused on rituals, questions of perhaps piety, but they're not really, they don't have a political project. And they're no longer focused on politics, and they've lost, if they ever had a revolutionary project of transformation, of radical social and political transformation, they've lost that. They've become run-of-the-mill, as I've kind of said previously in a previous reading of Roy. I said he thinks of them as run-of-the-mill new fundamentalists. They're just guys who, or girls, who want to be pious or claim an Islamist identity, but have no political project. And that actually he's seen that this move to Islamization in kind of at the private level, in private affairs and individual level, is a banalization of the Islamist project and banalization of Islamism in general. Now he kind of repeats this in reference to the current context, saying that the Islamist politics was not relevant because it has kind of lost revolutionary dynamic for some time now, and it continues to be primarily focused on rituals and morality, and not really politics. And but he's also been somewhat revisionist about his thesis, because he said, when I talked about the failure of political Islam, he's made this argument in a recent article, I think it was published in the Journal of Democracy. He said, when I talk about the failure of political Islam, I never meant actually that they will not take over power. I just said that they do not have a project. But so taking over power, becoming part of government or forming government is not really what he considered success or failure. Failure is about this revolutionary dynamic. But I think he's a bit revisionist, because of course if you look back into the earlier work he was saying actually they failed because they didn't take over power. They didn't form a government as such. In any case, I do not take issue with many of these propositions in the sense that I agree that there has been Islamists have increasingly focused on questions of morality, and they've done that, yes, over the last 2 decades. Where I disagree, and I've argued this before in a previous engagement with Olivier Roy, is that the politics of morality, or the engagement in the grounds of morality, is a certain form of politics, and it is about power and a contestation. It has transformative impact to the extent that this contest over morality in the public sphere is about dictating the norms. It's about saying what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong in gender interaction in the public sphere, for instance, in the family, and so on. These are relations of power that have to be understood politically as political if we approach the political in the broad sense, not the political as only being about government taking over government. If the political is actually about relations of power in society, and these include relations in the family and relations between gender, between men and women, then if Islamist project is about transforming these relations, it is political. And if it's about forming political subjectivities or subjectivities, the good Muslim or constructing who the bad Muslim is and making these kinds of evaluation and make them acceptable throughout society, that this is actually a political project, even if it is worked through society rather than through the institutions of government. Because, in fact, this kind of division between state and society, as, you know, as students of political science and anthropology, I'm sure we're all aware of that these boundaries are to a great extent artificial, that politics and power relations are everywhere. They're not just localized in government institutions or in the institutions of the state. They are everywhere in society, basically. And their transformations or reproduction are matters of power and contests. So Islamists, if we approach the political in the broader sense, and not just being about government and the state, institutions of government and the state, then we see that Islamists have always been active politically and never lost their project. Of course, Islamists are not a single unitary group, but rather we're talking about diverse groupings, and even the old labels that I've used and many others have used previously are now today probably very problematic. When we used to talk about militant Islamists, conservative Islamists, and so on, we have a broader range of Islamists, and it's very difficult to draw lines at times between the various groupings because there is much overlapping and grounds that they share as well. Now the other position, still on the post-Islamist argument, is put forward by Asif Bayat, who has also reiterated his own conception of post-Islamism, and it is somewhat different than that put forward by Olivier Roy. Bayat's assessment about post-Islamism is that and the Arab uprisings as being post-Islamist, that these revolutionary uprisings are about a quest for democracy and about a demand for civil rights and participation. And in that sense, they've transcended the Islamist project, and they're not really about the Islamic State. So here again, we have Islamist politics being understood primarily as being about being a project of state and about some conception of what an Islamic state is. Again, we'll say that Islamists would vary, but in both Roua's and Bayat's construction of what Islamist politics is about, the state is so central to understanding Islamist politics. So if takeover of the state is not really what the actors are seeking, then they are not really after, they're not part of Islamist politics. Now, I would say that again, in reference to the contention, Bayatist contention is that we cannot relegate the work of Islamization that is done by various Islamist groups, the Salafis, the Muslim Brothers, and so on, to the margin of politics. This is really the heart of politics, and I'll come back to that in my discussion later. But basically, a key argument that I'm putting forward here, that Islamization and re-Islamization has been at the heart of Islamist politics. It's a part of a counter-hegemonic project that a number of various and diverse Islamist actors have engaged in, and they continue to engage in. And what is important for us is to see how they go about this and how this is inserted at the local level and integrated in the everyday life. So that should be like one of the questions: how do various Islamist actors connect with ordinary people in the everyday through this kind of their social activism, through their efforts of re-Islamization, and how they are transformative of society in that, at that level or in these spheres. Now, in contrast to Olivier Roy and Asif Bayat's propositions, we have other scholars who've extrapolated an Islamic identity from the outcome of the elections that took place after the uprisings. So, following the uprisings, when we had particularly in Egypt and Tunisia, when we had Islamists win election, national elections, parliamentary election, or have a good showing in the various referendum regarding constitutions and so on, they've said, okay, well, that's an Islamist victory, or victory for the Islamists, and particularly for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and for Nahda in Tunisia. And basically then they projected this onto the uprisings to say that these uprisings are Islamists in character. This is particularly the case in some of the writings coming from the transitology literature. Political scientists who are interested in transition to democracy and who've been looking at how Islamist actors have been integrated into the political sphere, how the inclusion, those who talked about the moderation thesis, that through inclusion in the political sphere and elections and so on, Islamists moderate and can be included as part of the transition to democracy. Now, again, I think the conclusion that Islamist politics or the Islamists have been victorious in the uprisings and that these uprisings then turned out to be Islamist are a bit problematic, because the outcome of elections are just outcome of one set of elections that can change the next time around, and we've seen that actually in the case of Egypt. Although there was much propaganda, manipulation by state institutions and so on, we've seen actually a counter-mobilization, a massive counter-mobilization against the Muslim Brotherhood. So which of these outcomes, the referendum that took place in January 2014, which was kind of a verdict that it can be read as anti-Muslim Brotherhood, or the earlier referendum of 2012, which was read as a verdict as pro-Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, these outcomes are changeable and therefore are not sufficient to say outcome of election is an expression of an absolute support for one group or another. They are actually contextual and they're contingent and they can change. So they're not sufficient to speak of the Arab uprisings as Islamist uprisings on the basis of the outcome of the elections. And in fact, of course, many factors will help us understand the outcome. Why, in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, at one point, the Islamists were, the Nahda, the Muslim Brothers, and the Salafis in Egypt did very well in the elections. They happen to be the better organized, they happen to have a longer history of activism, and also the reading of the electorate in particular context and at a certain point was that in the case of Egypt, for instance, in a recent work by